The jungle was alive in a way no place should have been. Thick vines tangled in spirals around ancient broken structures, their origins lost to time. The air hung heavy with the scent of wet moss and metallic tang, the latter seeping from the biomechanical predators that prowled beyond sight. Even standing still, Raven Duval felt the unseen eyes of the wild on him, observing, assessing. He shifted uncomfortably and adjusted the shoulder strap of his pack, his pulse pistol tucked tightly at his side. The crash site was not far, but each step toward his ruined ship felt like wading through tar. Every vine, every root was a trap waiting to be sprung. His boots crunched against debris, jagged bits of metal and glass that had once belonged to structures now swallowed by this relentless wilderness. Varos 5, they called it. The wild planet. Raven had heard of it in passing, whispered about in backwater ports and late-night cantinas. A once thriving colony world abandoned centuries ago after a war no one cared to remember. Most people avoided it, content to let nature reclaim whatever sins the planet held. Yet here he was, stranded. His ship, the Wayfarer, lay half-buried in a thicket a few clicks away, its engines blown out by a freak solar storm as he navigated a routine cargo run. A stupid, avoidable mistake, one Raven would be kicking himself for if he weren't too busy scanning the dense foliage for movement. The pulse pistol felt like little more than a toy against the biomechanical monstrosities rumored to haunt this place. Then he heard it. A scream. It cut through the stillness like a blade, sharp and keening. Raven froze mid-step, his breath catching in his throat. The sound was unmistakably a scream, but it wasn't human. There was an odd cadence to it, a tone that resonated somewhere deep in his chest. He turned slowly, his gaze scanning the shadows. The scream came again, more distant now, but undeniably real. Someone, or something, was out there. Impossible, he muttered to himself, though the sound of his own voice didn't comfort him. Varos 5 was supposed to be dead, empty of civilization save for the half-sentient predators that roamed its surface. No one lived here. No one could live here. Yet the scream came again, pulling him deeper into the jungle. Against better judgment, Raven moved toward the sound. He couldn't ignore it. Even if it was some strange trick of the planet, a glitch in its biomechanical ecosystem, he had to know. Each step carried him further from the relative safety of his crash site, his fingers tightening around the grip of his pistol. The vegetation grew denser, the air thicker. Raven's boots sank into the soft, damp earth with every step. The scream turned into a low, rhythmic keening, almost like a call for help. It led him to the ruins. The structure loomed out of the jungle like the skeleton of a great beast, half swallowed by vines and decay. Columns of rusted metal and crumbled stone jutted into the air at awkward angles, their purpose long forgotten. Raven hesitated at the edge of the clearing, his gut screaming at him to turn back. The sound was coming from inside. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward. The ruins were more extensive than they first appeared, stretching underground through gaping holes in the earth. Raven descended cautiously, the light filtering through cracks in the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the walls. And then he saw it. The stasis pod sat tilted at an angle, embedded in the ground, like a relic of another time. Its surface was covered in a thin layer of grime, but the faint glow from within was unmistakable. Raven crouched, his heart hammering in his chest. Inside the pod was a woman, or something like one. Her features were sharp and alien, her skin a pale, almost iridescent blue that shimmered faintly in the dim light. Long, dark hair floated around her head like ink suspended in water, and her closed eyelids flickered with the rapid movements of someone trapped in a nightmare. The scream came again, but this time it was clearer, less of a sound and more of an impression. It came from her. Raven leaned closer, his hand brushing against the pod's control panel. Symbols and markings unfamiliar to him danced across the screen, their meaning lost to time. "Who the hell are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The pod's systems flickered weakly, as if sensing his presence. A series of lights blinked on, casting the room in an eerie glow. The woman's eyes snapped open. They were silver, bright and piercing, and they locked onto Raven with a mix of terror and fury. She slammed a hand against the inside of the pod, her mouth moving frantically. No sound came, but her expression spoke volumes. She was screaming. Raven scrambled back, his pulse pistol aimed instinctively at the pod. His mind raced. This wasn't possible. No one should have been alive in a stasis pod for this long, especially not on a planet like Veros 5. The woman continued to pound against the glass, her movements growing more frantic. A hairline crack began to spread across the pod's surface. "Damn it," Raven muttered, lowering his weapon. He didn't know who or what she was, but leaving her here wasn't an option. He couldn't ignore her cries. With a reluctant sigh, he began working on the pod's control panel, his fingers moving over the alien symbols. The crack widened, and with a sharp hiss, the pod's seal broke. The woman collapsed into his arms, her body cold and trembling. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Raven held her carefully, his mind reeling as she looked up at him with those silver eyes, her expression a mix of fear and relief. Then the jungle roared. The biomechanical predators had found them. The alien woman weighed less than he expected, her cold form trembling faintly in his arms. She clutched at his jacket with hands that were delicate but deceptively strong, her nails catching on the fabric as if anchoring herself to reality. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each one a raspy whisper against the oppressive silence of the jungle ruins. Raven didn't have time to marvel at her or ask questions. The jungle was waking and its hunger was palpable. A distant growl rolled through the air, low and guttural, vibrating in his chest. The biomechanical predators. He'd heard stories of them, amalgamations of flesh and machine, products of whatever unholy experiments had been conducted here before the colony fell. They were relentless hunters, built to kill. Raven shifted the woman in his arms, his muscles tensing as he scanned the shadows. The ruins offered some cover, but they were a labyrinth of dead ends and crumbling passages. Staying here was a death sentence. "Can you walk?" he asked her, his voice low but firm. Her silver eyes fluttered open, unfocused and dazed. She muttered something in a language he didn't recognize, her voice melodic yet strained. "Yeah, I don't understand you either," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder. Another growl, closer this time. The woman tried to push herself upright, her hands trembling against his chest. It was clear she wanted to stand, but her legs buckled the moment she tried to bear weight. She let out a frustrated hiss, her sharp teeth briefly flashing in the dim light. "All right, looks like I'm carrying you," Raven said, hoisting her more securely against him. "Just don't bite me, okay?" She stared at him, her expression unreadable, but she didn't resist. The jungle's cries grew louder, the sound of snapping branches and mechanical whirs echoing through the ruins. Raven moved quickly, his boots crunching against the broken stone as he navigated the uneven terrain. The dense foliage pressed in around them, vines and roots twisting like skeletal fingers reaching for his ankles. He cursed under his breath as he ducked through a narrow passage, the woman's weight pressing against his chest. He couldn't keep this up for long. His ship was still several kilometers away, and the predators were closing in fast. Then, as if answering his thoughts, a shadow moved in the corner of his vision. Raven froze, his pulse pistol snapping up instinctively. The alien woman tensed in his arms, her silver eyes darting toward the movement. A sleek, quadrupedal form emerged from the shadows, its body a grotesque blend of organic sinew and metallic plating. Its glowing red eyes locked onto them, its jaw unhinging to reveal rows of serrated teeth. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Raven muttered, backing away slowly. The creature let out a piercing screech, its joints clicking and hissing as it prowled forward. "Hold on," he told the woman, gripping his pistol tightly. The creature lunged, Raven fired, the pulse pistol's blue energy bolt striking the predator square in the chest. It stumbled, but didn't fall, its mechanical limbs absorbing the impact with horrifying efficiency. "Figures," he said, firing again as he retreated. The second shot hit one of its legs, causing it to falter just long enough for him to duck into another passage. The woman clung to him, her breathing rapid and shallow. She muttered something again, her voice urgent and strained. "Now's not the time for a language lesson," he snapped, his own breath coming in short bursts as he ran. The ruins opened into a clearing, a vast expanse of broken stone and overgrown vines stretching out beneath the shadow of a massive derelict structure. It looked like a control tower of some kind, its spire cracked and leaning precariously to one side. Raven hesitated for only a moment before heading toward it. The tower's height might give them a chance to signal for help, or at least give them a better vantage point to assess their situation. The predator's screech echoed behind them, joined by the sound of others. "Great. It brought friends," Raven muttered. The climb to the tower's entrance was grueling, the stone steps slick with moss and debris. By the time they reached the top, Raven's arms burned from carrying the woman, and his lungs ached from exertion. The interior of the tower was surprisingly intact, its walls lined with dormant consoles and flickering holographic displays. Dust hung thick in the air, catching the faint glow of the consoles as they hummed weakly to life at Raven's presence. He set the woman down carefully against a wall, her body slumping as she fought to stay conscious. Her silver eyes watched him intently, a flicker of trust mingled with lingering fear. "Stay here," he said, not that she had much choice. He approached one of the consoles, his fingers brushing over the alien symbols etched into the control panel. The interface was unfamiliar, but he recognized enough to piece together its function. It was some kind of energy grid, possibly connected to the ruin's defenses, or its predators. "Let's hope this doesn't make things worse," he muttered, pressing a series of buttons. The tower shuddered, and a low hum filled the air. Outside, the jungle roared in protest, as a burst of light shot out from the tower's spire, illuminating the surrounding area. The predators' screeches turned to panicked cries, and their glowing red eyes vanished into the shadows. For now, they were safe. Raven slumped against the console, his pulse racing as he glanced back at the woman. She was watching him with an intensity that made him uneasy, her gaze almost predatory despite her weakened state. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice quieter now. She didn't answer, but her lips moved, forming words he couldn't understand. Then she raised a trembling hand and pointed at the console. "What? You know what this is?" She nodded weakly, her expression pained but determined. Raven exhaled sharply, running a hand through his sweat-soaked hair. This day just kept getting weirder. "All right," he said, moving back to her side. "Looks like you've got some explaining to do when we're out of here." The woman's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, though her silver eyes remained wary. And somewhere deep within the jungle, the planet stirred. The alien woman stirred again, her breathing heavier now, as if the tower's dim energy had reignited something dormant within her. Raven didn't miss the way her gaze sharpened, scanning the room with renewed alertness. It was as though her instincts were attuned to something just outside his own perception. "What is it?" Raven asked, voice low, though the quiet around them seemed to demand a whisper. Her lips parted as if to speak, but instead she pointed again, this time toward the tower's far wall. Raven followed her gesture, eyes narrowing at the faint outline of a doorway obscured by overgrowth and debris. It wasn't part of the main structure. It was hidden. He glanced back at her. "You think there's something important in there?" Her nod was deliberate, her expression grave. Raven hesitated. The predators outside were still close enough to be a problem, their guttural growls echoing faintly through the jungle. But staying here too long wasn't an option either. The energy surge from the tower might have scared them off temporarily, but it had also painted a target on their location. "All right," he said, grabbing his pack and slinging it over his shoulder. "But if this is some kind of death trap, we're having words, assuming we survive." The woman tilted her head, the faintest flicker of amusement crossing her face, though her exhaustion remained evident. Raven approached the concealed doorway, using his multi-tool to cut away the vines and debris. As he worked, the subtle vibration of the tower's energy pulsed beneath his feet, a reminder of how old and unstable the structure was. Finally, the doorway gave way with a groaning creak, revealing a narrow corridor bathed in dim, flickering light. The walls were etched with unfamiliar symbols, and a faint, acrid smell wafted through the air, like burned metal and decay. "Great, just what I needed." "A creepy hallway," Raven muttered, glancing back at the woman. "You coming?" She pushed herself to her feet with effort, her movements slow but deliberate. When she reached him, she leaned heavily on the wall for support, her silver eyes meeting his with an unspoken determination. Together they stepped into the corridor, the door sliding shut behind them with a hiss. And the deeper they ventured, the colder the air grew. The walls pulsed faintly with an otherworldly glow, the symbols etched into them appearing to shift and ripple as if alive. Raven kept his pulse pistol at the ready, his fingers twitching with unease. "Does any of this look familiar to you?" he asked, his voice echoing softly in the confined space. The woman nodded, her expression unreadable. She reached out, tracing one of the symbols with her fingers. The light beneath her touch brightened briefly, then dimmed again, as though reacting to her presence. "You really are full of surprises," Raven murmured, watching her closely. Before she could respond, the corridor widened into a larger chamber. The room was circular, its ceiling arcing high above them. In the center stood a cylindrical structure, encased in translucent panels that flickered with shifting data streams. The woman gasped softly, her hand clutching at his sleeve. "What is it?" Raven asked, stepping forward cautiously. The cylindrical structure emitted a low hum, and as they approached, a holographic interface sprang to life. Symbols and diagrams spun in the air, incomprehensible to Raven, but clearly meaningful to the woman. She moved toward it, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten, her fingers dancing across the holograms as if she'd done it 1,000 times before. The room seemed to respond to her presence, the lights growing brighter and the hum intensifying. Raven frowned, his unease growing. "You sure this is a good idea?" Before she could answer, a sharp clanging sound echoed from the corridor they'd just left. Raven spun around, pulse pistol raised. The sound grew louder, closer, metal scraping against stone, punctuated by heavy, deliberate steps. "Damn it," he muttered, backing toward the woman. "We've got company." The woman turned, her eyes wide with alarm. She said something in her melodic language, her tone urgent. "Yeah, I got the gist. Something bad is coming," Raven replied, his heart pounding. The clanging steps gave way to a guttural growl, and a massive shadow loomed at the entrance to the chamber. The predator emerged, larger and more grotesque than the one he'd encountered earlier. Its biomechanical body glistened with a sickly sheen, its glowing red eyes locked onto them with predatory focus. "Oh, come on," Raven muttered, firing a shot at the creature. The energy bolt struck its shoulder, causing it to stagger but not falter. The predator let out an ear-piercing screech, its joints hissing as it charged forward. Raven fired again, aiming for its legs this time. The creature faltered, its metal limbs buckling under the impact, but it wasn't enough to stop it entirely. "Whatever you're doing over there, do it faster," Raven shouted at the woman. She didn't respond, her focus entirely on the holographic interface. Symbols and diagrams shifted rapidly as her fingers flew over the controls. The predator lunged, its claws swiping dangerously close to Raven's head. He ducked, rolling to the side and firing another shot. "Any time now," he yelled, his voice tinged with desperation. The woman's hands moved faster, her expression intense. Suddenly, the cylindrical structure emitted a high-pitched whine, and the entire chamber vibrated with energy. The predator froze mid-lunge, its body convulsing as arcs of electricity crackled around it. With a final, shuddering screech, it collapsed to the ground, smoke rising from its charred body. Raven stared at the creature, his pulse racing. What the hell just happened? The woman turned to him, her silver eyes blazing with a mixture of triumph and urgency. She spoke quickly, her tone commanding. "Still not understanding you," Raven said, gesturing for her to slow down. She sighed, her expression softening slightly. Then she pointed at the cylindrical structure and made a motion as if opening a door. "You're saying that thing's going to help us get out of here?" She nodded, her gaze steady. Raven exhaled sharply, holstering his pistol. "All right, but let's hope it doesn't make things worse." As the hum of the chamber grew louder, the jungle outside seemed to awaken once more, its distant cries promising more danger yet to come. The room was still vibrating from the collapse of the predator, its dark, twisted body now smoldering in the center of the chamber. Raven's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps, his pulse racing as his eyes flicked between the woman and the cylindrical structure that hummed with ominous energy. For a moment, all he could hear was the faint whirring of the machine and the pounding of his heart in his ears. The predator, or whatever it was, had fallen, but the world outside hadn't grown quiet. It was only getting louder. "What the hell is going on here?" he muttered under his breath, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. The woman moved toward the structure, her silver eyes now scanning the rapidly shifting symbols floating in the air. Her fingers brushed over the holographic display with a practiced motion, manipulating the light in ways Raven couldn't follow. Every now and then, the symbols would flash brighter, but the meaning still eluded him. "There's more to this place," she finally said, her voice steady but strained, a certain urgency to her tone. "Yeah," Raven replied, still watching the door nervously, "but I'd prefer to know how to get the hell out of here before we find out more." Her gaze flickered toward him, a faint hint of something, maybe amusement, maybe disdain, crossing her features. She shook her head slightly, as if the idea of leaving was irrelevant. "They won't let us go," she said, her voice low, almost inaudible over the hum of the machine. "Not unless we understand." Raven frowned. "What do you mean, they won't let us go?" Before she could answer, the room seemed to shudder, a low rumble beneath their feet. Raven's instincts kicked in. He reached for his pulse pistol, his gaze snapping to the doorway where the predator had fallen. The quiet outside was too heavy, too tense. It was a silence pregnant with something worse than the noise of the jungle. Then the rumbling ceased, and in that silence, a voice echoed in Raven's mind. It wasn't words, not exactly, but a presence, a sensation, a hum, deep and ancient, vibrating through his very bones. For a moment, he thought he'd imagined it, but the woman's expression froze, her face going pale as the faintest tremor ran through her. She glanced at him, her voice trembling now. "It's awake." Raven's heart skipped a beat. "What is?" But she didn't answer him. She didn't have to. The ground shook again, stronger this time. The hum from the cylindrical structure turned to a shriek, high and piercing, cutting through the air. Raven's instincts told him to run, but he couldn't move. Something invisible seemed to bind him to the spot. The woman turned, her eyes wide with something that wasn't fear, but something close to it, something like recognition. She stepped toward the cylindrical structure, a look of grim determination on her face. "Do you know what this place is?" Raven's voice was sharp, anxiety making his words brittle. "What's happening?" The woman hesitated, then slowly nodded. "This place is a prison, and we are its prisoners." Raven blinked. "A prison? What are you talking about? We're not—" "You are," she interrupted, her voice cutting through the confusion. "You've been brought here for a reason." She stepped back from the structure, as if the air around it had become suddenly too thick to breathe. "All of us have. The planet is alive, Raven. It has always been alive." A chill ran through him at the words. "You're saying the planet?" His voice trailed off, lost in the implications of what she was suggesting. "Not just the planet," she replied, her voice darkening. "The beings that created it. They were not gods, not by any means, but they had the power to shape worlds, and they did, for their own purposes. The war you've heard of, the one that destroyed so much of the galaxy, it wasn't a war between species, Raven. It was a war of creation, a war over control of a weapon. He took a step toward her, ignoring the sweat that now slicked his palms. A weapon? The planet itself, she said, her gaze distant, like she was seeing something only she could comprehend. The planet was built to house a living weapon, one that could destroy entire fleets, wipe out civilizations with a thought. It was never meant to be free. Raven's pulse quickened as he processed her words. And you were part of that weapon? She nodded, her expression hardening. I was the last of them, the last of my people. My kind was created for one purpose, and when the war ended, we were abandoned here, forgotten. We were not allowed to die, not allowed to fade away. We were left to exist in stasis, waiting for someone to awaken us. The hum in the room grew louder again, and Raven's throat went dry. So what happens now? Her eyes met his, and for the first time, Raven saw the weight of everything she had endured in them, the desperation, the rage, the knowledge that she had never truly been free. Now, she whispered, her voice tight, the weapon is waking again, and it wants more than just freedom. The walls around them seemed to groan, the air thickening with an electric charge that sent a ripple of unease down Raven's spine. The woman reached for him, her hand trembling slightly as she grasped his arm. Raven, we have to leave, she said, urgency lacing her words. We're not alone anymore, they're coming for us. The rumbling returned, fiercer than before, and a monstrous shriek, different from the predator they had fought earlier, filled the air. Raven's heart pounded in his chest as the ground shook beneath them, and from somewhere deep within the planet's heart, something stirred. Something that had been waiting for far too long. And Raven realized, with a sickening clarity, that his role in this was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. The wild planet, the strange woman, none of it was a random encounter. He was part of a much larger, far more dangerous game. And he had no idea just how deep the rabbit hole went. A voice echoed again in his mind, one that was not his own, ancient and malevolent, thrumming with power. You will never leave. Raven's throat tightened. This was only the beginning. The ground shuddered beneath Raven's boots as he crouched low, his pulse hammering in his ears. The planet, or whatever force was controlling it, seemed to know their every move. The walls of the darkened chamber were alive now, pulsating with an eerie rhythm that reverberated through the bones. In the distance, there was the sound of something scraping across stone. Slow, deliberate, almost as if it was waiting, listening. He glanced at the woman beside him, her eyes locked onto the shifting walls, her face pale and strained. Her expression had shifted from calm determination to something more frantic, as though she were seeing something he couldn't. What's happening? Raven's voice broke the tense silence, his words thick with urgency. Why is the planet doing this? What does it want from us? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, her gaze flicked around the chamber, taking in the faint shimmering of symbols swirling in the air. Her lips tightened, her hands trembling as they hovered near her weapon, a sleek black blade of alien design that pulsed with a faint, dangerous energy. It's not the planet, she murmured almost to herself. It's the ones who left me here. Raven's stomach dropped. The dread he had been feeling since the first rumble of the ground now blossomed into something darker, a gnawing certainty that something far worse than what he had imagined was unfolding. Who? What do you mean? Her silver eyes met his, and for the first time, Raven saw something that looked like genuine fear. Not the kind of fear bred from survival instincts. No, this was a deeper kind. The fear of someone who had known their fate for too long. They weren't just creators. They were gods of war, Raven. They didn't abandon me. She cut herself off, her breath hitching. They put me here to be forgotten, but they made sure I'd never truly die. And they're coming for me. For us. They never meant for us to leave. A silence fell between them. A thick, oppressive thing that pressed down on Raven's chest. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of her words, but there was too much to process. His gaze shifted back to the walls, to the glowing symbols that continued to swirl and pulse around them. Something was changing. Something was waking. The planet is alive, she had said earlier. But what if it wasn't the planet itself that was the true threat? What if it was something far older, far more dangerous? Without warning, the air around them began to hum, a low guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. Raven's instincts flared, and he took a step back, pulling the woman with him. But she didn't budge. Her gaze had turned toward the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to be thickening, curling, coalescing. "Stay close," she whispered, her voice tight. Her hand closed around his wrist, pulling him toward the darker recesses of the chamber. "We can't let them see us yet." Raven wanted to argue, wanted to ask who they were, but the words died on his lips. The shadows were moving now, but they were no longer just shadows. They took shape, twisted forms that flickered in and out of visibility, like wraiths pulled from the very fabric of the planet. Raven's blood ran cold as he realized the figures weren't just haunting the walls. They were coming for them. They were here. A strange, resonant voice filled the chamber, distant but unmistakably present. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense, but more a deep-throated growl that reverberated within his skull, like it was speaking directly to his mind. "You are not meant to be here." Raven's skin crawled. The woman's grip on his wrist tightened, as if she could feel the weight of the voice too. She pulled him further into the shadows, her body tense with every step. "Do you understand now?" she whispered urgently. "It's not just about survival. It's about the power they hold. They control everything here, every element, every movement. And they want me back." Raven shook his head, still reeling from the words, but he felt the ground shake again. Stronger this time. The rumble grew louder, more intense, as if the very fabric of reality was bending in on itself. His breath hitched in his throat, and he could feel the pulse of the planet beneath his feet, as if it was reacting to the presence of something, or someone. "They've been waiting," she continued, her voice trembling. "Waiting for the right moment, for someone to come and break the cycle." Suddenly, the walls around them exploded in a flare of light, blinding and intense. Raven staggered backward, his arms instinctively shielding his face as the air around them crackled with energy. He could feel the static charge tingling along his skin, like a thunderstorm building inside the room. When the light faded, the shadows had formed into something tangible. Figures cloaked in dark, shimmering armor, their features hidden behind masks that gleamed with malevolent intent. Raven's heart skipped a beat as he recognized the shapes. They were like nothing he had ever seen before. The woman was already moving, her weapon drawn and flashing with an eerie, alien glow as she stepped between Raven and the figures, her body taut with lethal grace. "They're here," she said, voice cold as steel, "and I've waited too long to let them take me back." Raven's blood ran cold as the figures began to advance, their movements swift and unnatural. The air seemed to constrict around them, and Raven knew with a sickening clarity that this wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a fight for freedom, and for the future. And somewhere, deep within the twisting heart of the planet, the true weapon was stirring. The ground trembled beneath Raven's feet, each quiver a warning, a heartbeat, as if the planet itself was awakening to the inevitable. The chamber around them, once eerily quiet, had turned into a battleground, the air thick with tension and static. The woman, his companion, his unexpected ally, moved like a shadow, her movements swift and precise, each strike of her blade cutting through the dark, the sharp edge of her weapon glinting with unnatural energy. But even her speed and skill couldn't mask the fact that they were being overwhelmed. Raven's breath was ragged, his pulse hammering in his temples. His hands gripped the blaster at his side, the weapon unfamiliar but lethal in his grasp. The figures, those spectral beings, part shadow, part machine, continued to close in, their bodies flickering in and out of focus like a broken transmission. He had never encountered anything like them, not in his years as a cargo pilot, not in any of the isolated systems he had explored. The woman's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Get to the central core. Now you need to stop them before—" Her words were cut off by the deep, growling voice that echoed throughout the chamber, a guttural, resonating tone that seemed to crawl into their minds, wrapping around their thoughts. "You cannot stop what has already begun. The cycle is unbreakable." Raven's stomach twisted as the world around them seemed to shift, the ground underfoot warping and undulating. It was no longer just the mechanical predators closing in. It was the planet itself, alive, conscious, and seemingly determined to ensure that they never escaped. His gaze snapped to the woman, whose eyes were locked on the central point of the chamber, a glowing, pulsating core at the far end. There was something there, something in the light that seemed to draw her like a magnet. "It's the source," she whispered, almost to herself. "The heart of it all, the source of the control. We have to destroy it." But Raven hesitated. It was too simple, too clean. The chaos of their situation made it seem almost impossible, but what else could they do? What else could they hope to stop the oncoming tide of death? His heart pounded in his chest as the figures came closer, moving through the dark with an almost predatory grace. "Go!" she barked, her voice a whip crack of command that broke through his paralysis. "Now, Raven, do it!" With no further hesitation, Raven charged forward, running past the shifting forms, the blaster in his hand an extension of his will. The moment he moved, the ground seemed to respond, the walls flashing with light as the planet itself seemed to fight against him. Tendrils of dark energy lashed out, striking the air with a sound like thunder. But Raven didn't slow. He couldn't afford to. The woman was right behind him, her blade cutting through the air, striking down one of the advancing figures in a blur of motion. The others hesitated for a split second, but that was all they needed. Raven reached the core, his fingers wrapping around the alien mechanism, feeling the hum of energy pulse beneath his fingertips. He could hear the woman's footsteps behind him, her presence a silent but constant reassurance. "You will fail," the voice whispered. Too close now, swirling inside his head, pushing against his thoughts. "You cannot fight the will of the creators. They control you. They control her." He ignored the voice, the words too familiar, too much like the whispers of doubt that had plagued him since his first encounter with the planet. But now, there was something more, something deeper, something he couldn't quite grasp. He could feel it in the air around him, the tension thick and oppressive. The core was alive, its pulse syncing with his heartbeat, like a countdown to the inevitable. Raven's fingers trembled as they hovered over the glowing symbols etched into the core's surface. He didn't know what they meant. He didn't know how to stop it, how to undo the damage that had been done. All he knew was that he had no choice. "I can't do this," he said through clenched teeth, more to himself than to her. "You can," the woman's voice came, steady and unwavering. "You're the key. This is what you were brought here to do." He glanced over his shoulder. She was standing a few paces behind him, her eyes alight with determination. Her blade was still in hand, the energy humming softly as she kept the attackers at bay. The terror in her eyes was gone now, replaced with something colder, something more resolute. The words she spoke hit him harder than any physical blow could. He had always been a small cog in a much larger machine, just a cargo pilot, a man with no grand purpose, no mission that mattered in the grand scheme of things. But now it felt as if the weight of the universe was on his shoulders. He had no choice but to press forward. There was no turning back. Raven swallowed hard, the bitter taste of desperation on his tongue as he pressed his palm against the core. The symbols flared brighter, the air thick with the crackling energy. A sudden surge of power shot through him, and the room seemed to warp and twist around him, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Then, with a deafening sound like the cracking of a planet's crust, the core shattered. The ground buckled and groaned, the chamber collapsing in on itself. Raven was thrown to the ground, the air knocked from his lungs, and for a moment he thought it was over. But it wasn't. As the dust settled, the light began to dim, and the figures that had once advanced upon them stopped, their bodies stiffening. The planet itself seemed to sigh, the tension ebbing away as the dark energy that had pervaded the air lifted. The woman stood beside him, her breath heavy but steady, her eyes scanning the wreckage. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. But something had changed. The voice that had haunted them both since the beginning, faded, its presence slipping away like smoke. And with it, Raven felt the grip of the planet loosen. But in the silence that followed, Raven realized something that chilled him to the bone. The planet might be done with them, but the war was far from over. The true battle was just beginning. The planet was silent now. The once vibrant hum of the core had faded into nothingness, leaving an eerie quiet that seemed to stretch into infinity. Raven stood amidst the ruins of the chamber, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him like a heavy cloak. The collapse of the core had sent a shockwave through the ground, scattering debris and sending cracks spiderwebbing through the ancient stone walls. Yet, despite the chaos and the near-death experience, there was an unexpected peace settling over him. He hadn't expected to survive. He hadn't expected anyone to survive. But they had. The woman, the warrior who had shared this journey with him, stood a few paces away, her back to him as she surveyed the destruction. Her silhouette, lit by the dim glow of the still crackling energy around them, was a stark reminder of the bond they had formed. She had been the one to push him, to make him believe he had a purpose beyond the cargo ship he had once called home. Raven took a deep breath and ran a hand through his disheveled hair, his mind whirling. He could still hear the voice, the ancient whisper that had taunted him throughout their mission. But now it was gone. It no longer echoed in his thoughts, no longer threatened to consume him. It had faded with the shattering of the core. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice hoarse, as if the words had to fight their way out of him. The woman didn't turn to face him immediately. Instead, she looked down at the blade in her hand, her fingers trailing along the smooth edge as though seeking some reassurance in its familiar weight. Then she spoke, her voice low but steady. "For now," she said. "But nothing ever stays over on a world like this. Not for long." Raven nodded, understanding. He knew, deep down, that the end of one battle only meant the beginning of another. The planet's grip on them had loosened, but there were still forces at play, shadows that reached far beyond the core and into the fabric of the galaxy itself. This was no isolated conflict. This was a war that stretched across time, across worlds, and now he was part of it. "Where will you go?" he asked, his curiosity getting the better of him. Her eyes flicked to him then, sharp and knowing. "I'm not sure," she said, her gaze turning to the wreckage ahead. "But I can't stay here, not with the way things are now." She let out a long breath, something like regret flickering in her eyes. "There are more out there, more worlds, more people. They need help." The idea of more battles, more unknowns was overwhelming, yet Raven felt something stir within him, something he hadn't recognized until now, the pull of purpose. Before, his life had been a series of lonely, unimportant runs across the galaxy, his existence little more than a speck in the vastness of the universe. But in the past days, he had become part of something greater, and he couldn't ignore it. "I'll come with you," he said before his mind could catch up with the words. He had no plan, no grand vision, but the certainty of his statement felt like a final answer, one that had been waiting to be spoken for far too long. The woman's gaze softened, and she nodded. A small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. "You're not like the others," she said quietly. "You're not a soldier. You didn't come for this fight, but you fought anyway." Raven looked at her, surprised by the softness in her tone. He wasn't sure what to say in response, so he simply nodded. The journey they had undertaken together had changed him, more profoundly than he could explain. His past seemed distant now, a lifetime ago. And yet, his future, his choices from this moment on, felt more tangible than ever before. The ground beneath them groaned, a low rumble that spoke of the planet's lingering life force, and Raven turned his gaze to the horizon. The storm had passed, but there was no mistaking the fact that the world they stood on had been irrevocably altered. The ancient force that had held them captive, the malevolent presence that had tried to consume them, was gone. But its absence left a void, one that would eventually need to be filled, one way or another. "Are you ready?" she asked, her voice sharp as though she already knew the answer. Raven didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the debris that littered the floor. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, but there was no fear now, just the steady pull of something greater than himself. He had found his place in the chaos of the galaxy, and it was here, at the edge of this strange world, that his new life began. "I'm ready," he said. Together, they turned away from the shattered core and the remnants of the planet's dark heart. The path ahead was uncertain, a maze of uncharted worlds and unseen dangers. But as they moved forward, Raven realized something profound. This was not an end, nor was it a beginning. It was the middle of something much larger, something that he couldn't yet understand, but that he had come to accept. He was no longer the man he had been before this journey, before this world had revealed its secrets. Now he was someone new, someone who had seen the darkness and stepped into the light, even if that light was just the smallest flicker in the grand scheme of the universe. As they walked, Raven glanced at the woman beside him. Her face was set in a determined expression, her posture straight, as though she carried the weight of many battles in her bones. And maybe she did. But she was walking beside him now, not ahead of him, not alone. In the silent space between them, Raven felt an unspoken understanding pass. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The journey was far from over, but they were ready. The night on Xanthia was alive in ways no human could understand. To an outsider, the planet might seem cold, dark, an endless expanse of jagged cliffs and dense jungles that stretched across the horizon like a dream gone awry. But for those who had lived there long enough, the planet was a symphony of whispers, murmurs carried on the winds, the hum of ancient technologies buried deep beneath the surface, and the pulse of a power that never truly slept. Naira stood on the precipice of a cliff, the howling winds tugging at her silken garments, her long crimson hair swirling like flames in the night. Below her, the dark ocean roiled against the jagged rocks, sending spray into the air that glistened under the pale light of the two moons overhead. She didn't flinch. Her eyes, sharp as ever, were fixed on the horizon, where the shimmering lights of the city sprawled across the valley like a living organism, each flicker a pulse of activity. It was a city built on power, its veins threaded with wealth, corruption, and secrets, and it was in that city, under the gleaming towers of the ruling council, that her fate was being decided. But tonight, she had no intention of following the path they had chosen for her. The wind carried something with it, a scent, sharp and metallic. It was the smell of danger, the kind that had clung to the air the moment she had learned of the council's decree. She could feel the weight of their decision pressing against her chest, suffocating in its cold finality. She was to marry him, the man who had risen from nothing to wield the galaxy's most formidable influence, General Kalen. His name was like a blade in the air, sharp and unforgiving. He was everything she despised, calculated, ruthless, a predator cloaked in the guise of diplomacy. Marriage, on Xanthia, was not a union of love. It was a strategic bond, an alliance that could either elevate a family to the stars or drag it into ruin. And the council, having once been her family's power, was now pushing her toward a fate she could not abide. To them, she was nothing more than a pawn, a tool to be used to secure their dominance in the galaxy. Her fists clenched at her sides, and for a moment, her sharp gaze turned inward. There was no escape. Not by the rules, not by the traditions that bound her people. Women on Xanthia had no say in the matters of marriage. They were vessels, carriers of legacy and bloodlines, not souls with desires or ambitions of their own. That was why she had come here, to this desolate cliff, where the winds could carry her thoughts away and the sea could drown her doubts. This was the last place the council would look for her. And yet, as the silence stretched, it was broken by a low, almost imperceptible sound, a ripple in the air, a subtle shift in the currents. Something had arrived. She turned, her eyes scanning the shadows that clung to the edges of the cliffs. Her breath caught. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall and broad, moving with the grace of a predator despite the thick cloak that hid most of his form. She didn't need to see his face to know who it was. The air around him seemed to hum, a quiet intensity that reverberated in the bones. Kale, the human warrior, the one who had come to Xanthia on a peacekeeping mission, or so they said. But there was more to him than that. Something beyond his role as a soldier of honor. Naira. His voice was steady, unyielding. You shouldn't be here. I've been told that many times in my life, she replied, her tone cool, measured. But I'm not here to listen to the advice of others. Kale took a step closer, his dark eyes piercing the shadows. And yet you came to me. You know the council won't let you escape your fate. A bitter smile tugged at Naira's lips. I don't need to escape. I need to make them believe I have no choice. I need you to help me make them force me into marriage. Kale's brows furrowed, a flicker of disbelief flashing across his face. You're asking me to dishonor you? Her laugh was soft, laced with a quiet irony. To dishonor me would be to let me live a life as Kalen's wife. I won't be his, not willingly, not even if it costs me everything. The silence stretched between them, heavy and thick. Kale, known for his strict sense of honor, hesitated. He was a man who fought for freedom, for the oppressed, but this was a different kind of freedom, a twisted version. I can't force you into anything, he said after a long moment, his voice rough. It goes against everything I stand for. You misunderstand. Naira's voice was steady, but there was a flicker of desperation behind her eyes. I don't need you to force me into it. I need you to make the council think that I am already bound to Kalen. I need them to believe that I have no choice, that the marriage has already been coerced. That will save me. Only then can I regain control of my life. I don't need your honor. I need your deception. Kale's silence weighed heavily, but he couldn't tear his gaze from her. There was something in her eyes, something fierce, something unyielding that struck him with the force of a blow. She wasn't asking for his help out of weakness. No, Naira was asking for something far more dangerous, her freedom. And that, Kale realized, was a battle he might not be able to win. What you ask is not without consequences, he said finally, his voice dark with warning. I know, Naira replied, her voice unwavering. But sometimes, a cage made of gold is worse than one made of iron. Kyle said nothing, but the flicker of understanding between them was enough. This wasn't about politics. This wasn't about tradition. This was about survival. You're certain? He asked. I am certain, she answered, her eyes locked on his with a fierce clarity. The council won't stop until I'm bound to him, but I will not become his pawn. The wind howled around them, as if in agreement, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Kale nodded. They were both about to make a choice that would change everything. The question that lingered between them wasn't whether or not their plan would succeed. It was whether or not either of them could survive the consequences. The journey from the cliffs to the heart of Xanthia's capital was a slow one, wrapped in the shroud of night. Naira walked beside Kale, the silence between them charged, each footfall echoing in the cold, thick air. The city sprawled before them, its towering spires reaching up like jagged fingers, glowing faintly in the dim light of the two moons. The streets, once filled with the sounds of celebration and power, now seemed deserted. The council, despite their reach, preferred their decisions made behind closed doors, hidden away in the sanctum of their chambers. Tonight, The city felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of secrets. And those secrets were closing in around her, tightening with every breath she took. Naira couldn't shake the feeling that the walls of the city were closing in on her, that the eyes of the council, those unseen yet ever-present forces, were already watching. Even now, their reach extended beyond her, pulling at the strings of her fate. "You're certain of this?" Cale's voice broke the silence. He had asked the question a dozen times since their agreement, but his tone was beginning to lose its firmness. Something about this mission unsettled him more than he was willing to admit. Naira stopped, her back stiffening. She could feel his eyes on her as though searching for cracks in the resolve she had built over the past days. The cold wind bit at her exposed skin, but she didn't flinch. "I'm certain," she said, her voice a sharp contrast to the uncertainty that lingered in Cale's. Her mind was clear, even if her heart pulsed with an undercurrent of unease. The plan had been set in motion, and now there was no turning back. To back out now would be to abandon everything she had fought for. "We'll have one chance to make this work. If we fail, everything will be lost. Do you understand?" Kyle's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening in a way that made him seem even more formidable than before. He understood, more than she could ever know. He had seen the ravages of power firsthand, had fought and bled for causes that had been lost before they even began. This was different. "I understand," he said. His voice was low, a thread of warning lacing through his words. "But I don't need to remind you that deception is a dangerous game, Naira. The Council doesn't play by the rules. And if they believe we've crossed a line, they will come for us, and they won't stop until we're buried beneath the weight of their politics." She felt the weight of his words settle in her chest like a stone. It wasn't a matter of simply escaping the Council's grasp. It was about playing a game with forces that were far beyond her control. Even now, as they neared the safe house, where they would lay the first part of their plan, Naira could sense the danger closing in. Something felt off. Before she could respond, a shadow moved in the distance, a figure blending into the dark alleyway ahead of them. Naira's heart skipped a beat, her instincts flaring. She raised a hand, signaling Cale to stop. "What is it?" Cale asked, his voice tight, scanning the area. "I don't know," Naira murmured, her eyes narrowing. She took a cautious step forward, her body instinctively tensing as she moved closer to the alley. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't reacted. Was it an ally or an enemy lying in wait? The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the overgrown vegetation that lined the streets. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the eerie rustle of the wind, the faint hum of distant power generators. Then a voice low and familiar slipped from the darkness. "Careful, Naira. You're not the only one with a plan." She froze. The voice was cold, calculating, a voice she knew well, one that had haunted her dreams for years. It belonged to Alric, a member of the Council's inner circle, a man with eyes as sharp as his tongue. He had been a shadow in her life ever since her family's fall from power, a man who played games with people's lives like pawns on a chessboard. "What do you want, Alric?" she asked, her voice steady despite the surge of panic that rose in her chest. "Oh, don't worry, Naira." Alric's voice was tinged with amusement. "I'm not here to stop you. In fact, I think you're making a very interesting choice." He stepped forward, his silhouette emerging from the shadows. His features were sharp, almost too perfect, and his eyes gleamed with a dangerous intelligence. "But you should know. Things are not as simple as they seem. The Council isn't as blind as you think." Cale's hand went to the hilt of his blade, his posture tense, ready for a fight, but Naira held up a hand, signaling him to stay back. Alric was no fool, and a confrontation here would only make things worse. She needed information, answers to the questions that had been brewing ever since her family's downfall. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice edged with suspicion. Alric chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "You're walking into a trap, Naira. The Council knows you're planning something. They might not know the details, but they know you're desperate, and desperation is a dangerous thing." A chill ran down Naira's spine, but she didn't let it show. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that you're not the only one who wants to escape the chains of tradition," Alric said, his voice lowering, the words laced with an insidious promise. "But you're playing a game you don't fully understand. You're trying to outsmart the council, but they've already moved their pieces. You've already been caught in their web." Naira's pulse quickened, her heart pounding in her chest. The ground beneath her feet suddenly felt unsteady, as if the foundation of her plan was crumbling away. Was Alric telling the truth? Had they already anticipated her every move? "I'll be watching," Alric added, turning away, his footsteps echoing down the alley. "Don't be so sure you've won, Naira. There's always a price to pay." And with that, he was gone. For a long moment, Naira and Kale stood in the silence, the weight of Alric's words settling heavily on their shoulders. Kyle's eyes were dark, his face unreadable, but Naira could see the worry flickering behind his gaze. "Do you think he was lying?" Kyle asked. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice hollow. "But I do know this. Whatever happens next, we need to move quickly. We can't afford to wait any longer." But even as she spoke the words, she knew deep down that their plan had already set a course they could no longer control. The council's grip was tightening, and they were running out of time. The stakes had risen, and the cost of failure had never been clearer. Tonight, everything changed. The city of Xanthea was not the same as it had been just days ago. The air was thick with tension, a palpable charge that could be felt in every corner of the capital. The grand towers that had once stood as symbols of power now seemed like looming sentinels, their windows dark and silent, watching over a world on the edge of ruin. The council's eyes were everywhere, hidden in the shadows, lurking behind the facade of the city's grandeur, waiting for the first mistake to make their move. Naira stood at the threshold of the safe house, the weight of the decision she was about to make heavy in her chest. Kale was by her side, his jaw set in that way he had when the world seemed too large for anyone to control. For the first time, she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, something she had never expected from him. It was strange to see a man who had faced down armies, who had built his reputation on strength and honor, now faltering before the consequences of their plan. "We're running out of time," Naira said, her voice tight, eyes scanning the horizon. The shadows had grown longer, creeping into the corners of the world, and with each passing moment, the council's net tightened around them. Kyle didn't answer, only nodded, his posture rigid, tense. She didn't need to ask him what was on his mind. He could feel it too. The shift. Something had changed in the air, like the calm before a storm. But it wasn't just the council that had moved. Something else was at play, something more dangerous, more insidious than they had anticipated. The plan was already set in motion, and yet, as they made their way through the narrow, winding streets of the capital, Naira couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She had been raised on Xanthea, had spent her life in its labyrinthine corridors of power, and even now, she could feel the eyes upon them, eyes that knew they were walking the razor-thin edge of disaster. "Something's not right," she murmured. "I can't shake the feeling that we're being set up." Kale stopped, his hand moving instinctively to his weapon as he scanned their surroundings. The alleyways were silent, empty, too empty. "I don't think it's just the council anymore," Kale said, his voice low, dangerous. "I think there's someone else involved in this, someone we're not seeing." It was then that the first ripple in the air hit them, an inexplicable sensation, like a shift in the very fabric of the world around them. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Naira felt it, like a shadow crossing over the sun. "Did you feel that?" she asked, her voice tense. Kyle didn't answer immediately. He was scanning the rooftops now, his eyes narrowed, focused. "We're being tracked," he said. "Get down." Without hesitation, Naira ducked into the nearest doorway, her heart racing. She could hear the faint hum of engines, the low growl of an approaching craft cutting through the night air. In the space of a few breaths, she knew this was no coincidence. "Stay low," Kyle ordered, his voice clipped as he moved to take a position in the shadows, his senses on high alert. The craft appeared overhead, its shape silhouetted against the pale moonlight, a sleek black vessel that seemed to melt into the night, moving with an eerie precision. It hovered just above them, suspended like a phantom, before dropping down with a soft thud onto the nearby street. Naira's breath caught in her throat as the hatch slid open. Two figures stepped out, tall, cloaked in darkness, their movements fluid, almost predatory. "Kyle," she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who are they?" "I don't know," he said, his voice tight, "but they're not here by accident." The figures moved with an unnatural grace, their eyes scanning the shadows, searching for any sign of life. Kyle was already preparing to engage, his fingers curling around the hilt of his blade, but Naira held up a hand to stop him. "No," she said, her voice steady. "They're not after us. Not yet." But even as she spoke, a sickening thought crept into her mind, a realization that sent a chill down her spine. She had been walking into a trap all along, and it wasn't the council's trap. It was something far worse. The figures began to move again, not toward them, but toward the safe house they had been heading toward. Naira's heart skipped a beat. "They're after our target," she breathed. "Someone else wants Kalen." Kale cursed under his breath, his eyes narrowing in concentration. "We need to move, now." They couldn't let them reach the safe house. If they did, everything would be ruined. This wasn't just about Naira anymore. It was about something much bigger. In a blur of motion, they were moving again, rushing through the winding streets of the city, the hum of the black craft following them in the distance, growing louder. Naira could feel the weight of the stakes pressing in around her, crushing the air from her lungs. She had thought she knew what she was up against, the council, the politics, the tradition. But this was something else entirely. They reached the safe house just as the craft landed outside. The figures were moving toward the door, and Naira's mind raced. What were they after? Why did they want Kalen? "Kale, go," she said urgently. "I'll handle them." Kale hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering to the approaching figures. "You're not going alone." "I have no choice." Naira's voice was a whip crack of finality. She pushed him toward the side entrance of the building, her eyes never leaving the figures as they reached the door. She knew now what she had to do. With a quick, fluid motion, she stepped forward, blocking their path. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice fierce. The figures froze, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then one of them, the taller of the two, stepped forward, lowering his hood. Naira's blood ran cold. The man was older than she had expected, with silver hair and cold, unfeeling eyes. His features were sharp, his gaze unwavering. His voice, when he spoke, was like a blade slicing through the air. "I am not your enemy, Naira," he said, "but your father's enemies. They've been watching you, and now you've put everything at risk." Naira's mind reeled. Her father's enemies? What did this man know about her family, about her past? And why had he come for her now, at the very moment she was about to make her stand against the council? Her entire world seemed to tilt, as though the very foundation of everything she knew had been shattered. The tension in the air was suffocating, pressing in on Naira from all sides. The man before her, the one who claimed to know her father's enemies, stood as an unmovable obstacle in her path. His gaze, cold and impassive, felt like it could pierce through the deepest parts of her soul, unraveling her secrets without a single word spoken. Her heart raced, each beat thundering in her chest as she processed his words. Her father's enemies? She had thought her family's fall from grace was the result of political missteps and court intrigue. She had believed the council's growing influence was the root of her predicament. But this man, the silver-haired stranger, was suggesting something far darker, something far deeper. "What do you mean?" Naira demanded, her voice trembling, though she fought to keep the fury from seeping through. "Who are you?" The man did not immediately answer. He simply regarded her with a quiet, unwavering stare, as if measuring the very weight of her soul before deciding to reveal more. It felt as though time slowed, the moment stretching into infinity as Naira waited for him to speak. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low murmur that cut through the silence like a blade. "I was sent by those who have been watching you and your family for longer than you realize. Your father's rise was no accident, and neither was his fall. It was orchestrated." Naira's breath caught in her throat. "Orchestrated? What do you mean? By whom?" The man hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the darkened horizon, as if waiting for something to happen. A subtle shift in the air, a crackle of energy that Naira couldn't quite identify, made her pulse quicken. Something was wrong. Something far more complex was unfolding. "By the order of the Silent Watch," the man finally replied, his words hanging in the air like the weight of an executioner's axe. "They have been moving behind the scenes, shaping the destiny of Xanthea. Your father was merely a pawn in their game, a tool to further their agenda." The revelation hit her like a physical blow, the world spinning out of focus as the weight of his words settled into her bones. The Silent Watch, a name she had heard whispered in hushed tones by those who feared them, but never fully understood. They were not just an organization, they were a shadow, a force pulling the strings from the darkness. She had thought the Council was the true power on Xanthea, but it seemed they were nothing more than players in a game much larger than she could comprehend. Kyle, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "Who are you to tell us this?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous. "And why should we believe you?" The man's gaze shifted to Kyle, his expression unreadable. "You should believe me because I know who you are, Kyle of Earth, and I know what you are trying to do here. You are trying to protect her, trying to save Naira from a fate that has already been decided. But you are too late." Nira's heart skipped a beat. The man knew about Kyle? How? Kyle's stance hardened, his muscles tensing as if preparing for a confrontation. "You know nothing of my intentions, and less about my allegiance," he spat, his voice rising with a sudden edge. "So I suggest you explain yourself before you say something you can't take back." The man's lips twitched upward into something resembling a smile, but it was as cold and hollow as the space between the stars. "You don't understand, Kale. You are standing in the shadow of something far greater than either of us. And the truth you are searching for, about Naira, about her family, about the Council, it's already slipping through your fingers." The weight of his words hung in the air, as though he was slowly unraveling everything they had believed to be true. Naira, struggling to steady her breath, felt the storm of uncertainty swirling around her. If this was true, if the Silent Watch had truly been manipulating her family's rise and fall, then everything she had fought for was based on a lie. Her entire existence had been shaped by forces she had never even suspected. She turned away, her hand gripping the edge of the doorframe for support. She needed to think, to process. She could feel the pressure mounting inside her, threatening to tear her apart. Kale, sensing her distress, softened his tone. "Naira, whatever this man is saying, whether he speaks the truth or not, it doesn't change our path. We have a choice." He stepped closer, his voice quiet but steady. "We don't have to fall into their hands. You have the power to make your own destiny." She glanced at him, her heart aching. His words were comforting, but the weight of what she had just learned loomed over her like a thunderstorm, dark and unforgiving. "I can't escape this, Kyle," she whispered. "This war, this Game of Thrones, it's already been decided for me." "No," Cal said, his voice firm. "You can choose. You can fight." But even as she met his gaze, Nira's mind spun, the conflicting emotions tearing at her. On the one hand, she had always prided herself on her independence, her refusal to be manipulated. But now, with the Silent Watch's unseen hand pulling at the strings, With her family's history drenched in betrayal, she wondered if her fight for freedom had ever been her own. The man behind her, whoever he was, seemed to sense her hesitation. He stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with something that could only be described as amusement. "You still don't understand, Nira," he said softly. "It's not about freedom anymore. It's about survival." Her pulse quickened at his words. She felt trapped between two worlds, her past and her present, the choices she had made and the truth she was now forced to face. And the truth was this: everything she had believed was crumbling before her eyes. Suddenly, a deafening crack echoed through the night. The air was thick with the sound of distant explosions, the ground trembling beneath their feet. The safe house, the place where she had hoped to find refuge, was no longer safe. The Council's forces, or perhaps the Silent Watch themselves, had discovered their hiding place. The man's expression darkened, and for the first time, Nira saw a glimmer of something resembling urgency in his eyes. "It's too late now," he said. "You're already part of this game. There's no turning back." With those words, everything she had feared, everything she had tried to escape, crashed down around her. The storm had arrived. And now, Nira's choices, her sacrifices, would determine the future not just of her own life, but of Xanthia itself. The storm had passed, but the destruction it had left in its wake lingered. Nira stood at the edge of the battlefield, the cold wind biting at her skin, as the horizon above Xanthia's shattered landscapes glowed with the dim light of an uncertain dawn. Smoke and debris swirled around the wreckage of the Council's forces, their once proud banners now blackened and torn, their soldiers scattered and broken. It had been a victory of sorts, but at a cost. Her body ached with exhaustion, each step forward a struggle as she moved through the devastation, her eyes searching for Kyle. The last few hours had been a blur, a chaotic whirlwind of gunfire, flashing blades, and voices screaming in agony. The plan she and Kyle had set in motion had gone further than either of them had expected. But despite the violence and the bloodshed, one thing remained unchanged. She was no longer a pawn. Kyle was kneeling by a pile of fallen enemies, wiping the blood from his blade, his expression grim but resolute. When he saw her approach, his eyes softened, the weariness in them giving way to something that looked almost like relief. "You're alive," he said quietly, standing up to meet her. "Thanks to you," Nira replied, her voice hoarse. She took a breath, the weight of everything they had been through pressing on her chest like an iron bar. "I didn't think we'd make it out." Kale's lips twitched, as if he wanted to smile, but the grimness of the situation held him back. "I've been in worse situations." He paused, his gaze drifting over the destruction. "But this is something different. We've turned Xanthia on its head." Nira nodded. "The Silent Watch will never be the same. I've seen their true face now." They had fought tooth and nail to expose the shadowy order manipulating everything behind the scenes. It had taken everything they had, every trick, every betrayal, every weapon at their disposal. But now, as the last remnants of the Silent Watch's power crumbled, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing the truth was out. And yet, there was still that nagging feeling that something more was left unsaid, something buried deep within the heart of Xanthia that neither of them had yet to uncover. "We've done what we needed to do," Nira said, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the horizon. "The Council's gone. The Silent Watch is fractured. It's over." But Kale's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he looked away. "Not quite." Nira furrowed her brow, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean? The game's been won. The players have all fallen. There's nothing left." Kale's gaze met hers, intense and unwavering. "You're right that we've torn down the old structure, but you know as well as I do that power doesn't disappear. It doesn't die. It just changes hands." Her stomach tightened at the implication. "Are you suggesting that there's a new game to be played?" Kale finished, his voice low and dangerous. And you, Nira, you're at the center of it. The weight of his words sank in, and for a moment she felt the ground beneath her tremble once more. They had fought so hard to destroy the system, the puppet strings of the Council and the Silent Watch, but had they simply left a void for something worse to take its place? "We're not done yet," Kale continued, his voice softer now, but the determination in it still palpable. "You've taken the first step, but it's your next one that will decide everything." Nira stared at him, her thoughts racing. She had come to Xanthia to break free of the chains that bound her, to claim her future on her own terms. But was freedom truly achievable in a galaxy so rife with power struggles, so entrenched in political manipulation? Could she truly escape this life of strife and bloodshed, or had she already become too entangled in its web? "I never asked for this," Nira whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of frustration and realization. "I never asked to be part of a system so broken." Kale took a step toward her, his presence grounding her in a way that nothing else had. "No one ever does, but you've already shown you're stronger than anyone gave you credit for. You have the power to shape what comes next. Don't waste it." She met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. The finality of the choice before her weighed on her, a heavy stone that pressed down on her every thought. To choose now meant deciding who she would be, not just for herself, but for the entire galaxy. "Do you trust me?" Kyle asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes searching hers for the answer he needed. Nira took a deep breath, the memories of the bloodshed, the pain, and the victories flashing before her eyes like lightning in a storm. She had fought to survive, fought to make her own choices, but now, the question was no longer about survival. It was about power, and whether she had the strength to wield it. "I trust you," she said, her voice steady, stronger than it had ever been. A small smile tugged at Kale's lips. "Then let's finish this. Together." With that, they turned toward the city, a city that would no longer be bound by the chains of the past, a city whose future was now in their hands. The war for Xanthia's future had not ended. It had simply begun. The sun broke over the horizon, casting a golden light over the charred remains of the battlefield, bathing everything in its stark glow. Nira stood tall, the wind whipping through her hair, her resolve hardening like steel. In the end, it wasn't the battles they had fought that defined them, but the choices they had made. The future of Xanthia, and perhaps the entire galaxy, would be shaped not by the forces that had tried to control them, but by the two of them, standing on the precipice of something new. A new era was coming, and Nira was ready to meet it head-on.